The talk I'm giving today is going to cover the idea of religious change. I'm going to talk about religious change generally, but we'll also situate Adventism within that more general religious change. To give you a little background, here on the screen you see I went to a lot of Adventist elementary and high schools. Went to Walla Walla University for theology, got an MDiv from Andrews, then made a switch to sociology where I focused on sociology of religion, studied at Indiana University, Stanford, and now I'm at Cornell. So as has already been mentioned, my areas of focus are religion, gender, sexuality, public opinion, well-being, and social change. One of the things I'm really interested in with religion and then also social change at the intersection of each other is how religious change relates to other types of social change. And one thing I'm going to talk a bit about are global processes, things around institutionalization, deinstitutionalization. There have been shifts over time where religion used to be something that was not so institutional and systematic and organized, and oftentimes people practiced it within a local context. And then religions became more institutionalized, and then in some ways we're having a deinstitutionalization, and I'll talk about that. But what I'm presenting today will cover some of my research, other people's research, and then also some ideas that I am thinking through in relation to a project with Ronald Blosson and others on Adventism. So I'll be talking about religious change among individuals. I'll be talking about religious change in societies. I'll also be talking about how religious organizations themselves shift and change over time. So the general idea that I'm going to be sharing is all of this change is not simplistic and it's not just a straight line. I think sometimes people are looking for, is religion going up? Is religion going down? Are organizations becoming, more denominational or more sectarian? But I'm going to talk about how some of this is a bit of a pendulum. It's a little more circular. I've been developing an idea, and I'm going to show you a diagram, and I'll show you a few times of thinking about religious change in individuals, in societies, in organizations, in more of a circular way rather than just, following a straight line. So here's a figure from a study I recently published. The study is called Breaking Free of the Iron Cage, the Individualization of American Religion. The study focused on religious change among one generation of people, and I'll talk about that study later, but part of this study was laying out a theoretical framework. On the top, you can see a lot of the types of frameworks people have had for religious change in the past follow this more linear approach. So they suggest that religion is going from less rational to more rationalized, less institutional to more institutional, that there's a general faith that becomes more specific, that then there's sectarian religion, then institutional religion, and then people might say that following institutional religion would be secularization. So historically, what a lot of religion was, and still in many places is around the world, would maybe be things like folk traditions, cultural fusion, and syncretism. So people within a specific place would have a variety of ideas. If you think about, the religion of the ancient Egyptians or Phoenicians, they didn't necessarily have a name for that religion. It was the religion of the Egyptians or the religion of the Romans. And so religion was tied to a specific group of people in a specific place. Then over time, there sometimes becomes this kind of narrowing in and more specific views of ideas that then can get packaged together and then in some ways spread beyond the original place where it existed. So, we could think of in some ways Judaism as the religion of the Jewish people, but Christianity started to have a different type of operation here where Christianity was seen as for everyone and spreading everywhere. And there was not this idea of it being necessarily as much tied to a specific place or only one cultural group of people. So more recent religious shifts have been toward this idea of religions as systematic, as institutionalized. They might have a specific set of beliefs, maybe a book that lays out their theology, rather than just these kind of more, maybe narrative beliefs that people would share within a specific community. So these groups emerge that have more specific beliefs. they start as something of a movement, then they become a little more organized. So if we think about Christianity, we could think about Christianity as starting as essentially just the followers of Jesus. But then eventually Christianity as an institution emerges. We could actually think about Paul as playing a big role in the emergence of Christianity as more of an institution existing beyond, a group of people following this person named Jesus. So then there starts to be beyond the leader and, maybe after their death, things get organized and systematized and a tradition develops. And then eventually there might be an institutionalized religion. There might be professional clergy where they have more education, and then increasingly systematized doctrine. So we could think about Adventism as an example here, where, it's a group of people within the Millerite movement. They start having, a specific sense of ideas, but then eventually over time, they start to create an organization and an institution around these ideas that in some way started out a little more just dynamic, loosely held, and as a community of people. Then eventually, you have books that share, what does our group think and believe? You have, maybe a seminary where this is the official place where the leaders are trained. So the religion becomes more institutional. And then the argument is that sometimes after the institutionalization of religion and as it has become more systematic, through, say, the maybe modernization of society and like the more bureaucracy of society, that then following religion becoming more institutional would then be secularization. This is in some ways something that could be seen as secularization theory. We could see this maybe as traditional church sect theory. Below here, though, is I give a more dialectical approach to a faith-religion cycle, that faith and religion are in dialogue and in some ways tension, and that sometimes when religion becomes overly systematized, people then want to go back to what they saw as a more dynamic time of that faith. So for example, if we think about Christianity, a lot of movement now is toward, maybe people not even wanting to identify as religious, but as identifying as followers of Jesus, or getting back to the original ideas. To give you an example, I was working in a survey research center at Indiana University, and I was supervising interviews that people were doing with people around the country. This particular survey was not about religion. It was about family and social change. But there was a woman who was being interviewed, and any question that came up, she kept bringing up religion. She would talk about her faith. She would talk about what the Bible says. When she was asked, how often do you attend services? She said, multiple times a week. Do you believe in God? Yes, I believe with God with certainty. When she was asked how religious she was, she said not at all religious. I could kind of sense from the person doing the interview, and I was listening in to help just monitor things. I could sense from the person doing the interview that they were kind of puzzled by her answer. And I could tell that they were kind of wanting to figure out, what's going on, maybe ask a follow-up. But she just continued talking, and she explained that her pastor tells her that they aren't religious, that they're followers of Jesus. And so in her perspective, she doesn't see herself as religious. She sees herself as a follower of Jesus. But what we might think of as very religious is, in a sense, how she lived her life. Her faith was important. The Bible was important. She went to church all the time. She really thought about what her pastor said. So we see this shift now that some people have, even among highly religious people, to maybe kind of want to get away from this idea of being religious and being a part of this institution, and getting back more to what might be seen as the earlier forms of the faith tradition, when it was maybe people, meeting together in homes, people having this dynamic relationship with the belief system in one another and to follow Jesus rather than maybe a set of doctrines. So here in this circular approach, what I have is the kind of similar start that, we have these folk traditions, cultural fusion, syncretism, and then this movement that occurs, and it's essentially the same movement, but that movement backwards can happen as well, and that this can happen at different points in time, and that this can happen among an individual, how they change their views. It can happen among a society, or it can happen where maybe some religious group changes the way they approach things. And so oftentimes people maybe want to get back to the roots of their faith. And in some ways, that's moving away from the systematization, the organization, the bureaucracy of it. And they want to get back to the things that were more dynamic dynamic. If we think about Adventism, maybe it's someone who, maybe they, regardless of what they think about the doctrines or, the systematic theology and all of these things, that's not what they're focused on. Maybe they're focused on, kind of a dynamic approach. Maybe they're thinking about Jesus. Maybe they're thinking about the Bible. And maybe they will read, things about the doctrine. They will engage these things, but they want to get back to something that's less about the religious parts and more about the faith parts. So perhaps, they have maybe questions about the institution, but they really still follow the faith tradition. Some people, though, maybe they move so far back on this circle that they end up maybe not necessarily holding the beliefs of one particular group, but maybe having a more general spirituality, maybe, connected to, thinking about the earth. We could think about things like pantheism and other things that people might move toward. So, you don't need to know everything about this figure here, but I wanted to give a little bit of a sense that instead of a more linear approach, I'm talking about a more circular approach. And I'll circle back to some of these ideas later on. So I'm going to talk about some of the things that help explain what's happening with religion. Some of this is going to be focused on the US, but some of these things are relevant elsewhere. So as you may have heard, more people are moving away from having specific religious affiliations. Part of this is people moving away from affiliating with any religion. There's also a pattern happening among Christianity where there's a growing number of people who, if you ask them how they identify, they're not necessarily going to identify with a specific denomination. They're going to say, I'm just Christian or I follow Jesus. There's even a movement now toward people maybe not even understanding the differences. So for example, among older generations, the Protestant Catholic distinction was maybe well understood, but that in some ways there's a movement now toward people maybe attend a church and not even realize that it's a Protestant church. There's a lot more, community churches and non-denominational churches where people are going and they are having the practices, the beliefs, the approaches that might have traditionally been Protestant or evangelical, but yet they now, maybe don't make so many of these distinctions. Sometimes too, this is where churches are located. So my parents now live somewhere where there's not an Adventist church super close by. So sometimes they will go to their local community church that's closer to where they live. It doesn't necessarily mean that they aren't Adventist, but that, they'll go to this church where people might just all identify as Christian in this space, and then they may also have other specific identities, but that when they practice together in that space, they are just practicing as Christians. So both people are moving away from identifying with specific religions, but even among Christianity, people are moving away from identifying with specific denominations. I'm going to talk a little bit about how some of these shifts can be explained by things like politics. So where religion becomes more political, people maybe take issue with some of the ideas that are held there. And so people that hold beliefs that are different from their congregation might start, kind of disassociating from that congregation or that denomination. There's also generational change happening. I'll talk about polarization. This is in some ways connected to political polarization, but there's also a polarization of religion where a lot of the moderately religious people are kind of fading away into no affiliation, and people tend to either be either very religious or maybe not really religious at all. I'll also talk a little bit about an idea of individualization and a movement away from institutions and more toward individual authenticity, and the idea of the sacredness of the individual, that people think that, rather than having loyalty to an institution, that they say that what we should do is care about other people. And this is very much tied to things like the idea of the golden rule, that you shouldn't, tell others how to be and what they can do. So I'm just showing you here the abstracts from a couple of well-known studies where they were trying to explain why more people have no religious affiliation, why they're not tied to any specific organized religion over time. An interesting thing to think about when you hear this idea of nones, so N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N, that the growing number of nones is not necessarily all people who are secular. So this is a group of people, when asked on a survey, oftentimes the General Social Survey is one of the ones most used. People will be asked, which of these religious groups is your preference? And so there will be like, a lot of specific groups. Then maybe if someone said Protestant, then it'll ask them about specific types of Protestants. But then at the end of that list of options, that there will be something that says, I have no preference. So this person might, be a secular person, or they might just be a person who doesn't want to identify with any one specific religion. Even if it's a person who maybe attends church every week, believes in God and Jesus, reads the Bible, but maybe they will still say, I have no preference among this group of options. So the nones, in many ways, are this kind of leftover category that we now talk quite a bit about. But sometimes, what exactly a none is, there's a lot of variety within that. And these scholars have shown how Michael Hout and Claude Fisher, in a couple of studies here, they've basically shown how it tends to be liberals and to a lesser extent moderates who will say who will say they have no religious preference. And then also people of younger generations are more likely to say they have no religious preference. So if we're trying to understand why there's more people that say they have no religious preference over time, it seems that politics and then generational shifts explain a big part of that. So here is from the Houghton Fisher 2014 study, and they show how over time, this is the percentage of people who say they have no religious preference. Over time, the number was pretty stable. It maybe climbed a little bit, but it was, just a little bit above 5% of people. But starting in the late 80s and early 90s, this really started growing over time. There's different types of explanations given. Some people say it's about the rise of the religious right and religion and politics becoming more, interrelated and hard to separate out. And then liberal people who don't affiliate or associate with the religious right or conservative politics don't feel like religion kind of matches their values anymore. Some of this could be about new generations of young people. Something that doesn't get talked about a lot, but which I wonder about is the fall of the Berlin Wall, and perhaps the end of the Cold War might make it so that maybe people felt like they could be seen as communist if they said they had no religious preference, because it was seen as kind of the Christian United States versus the atheist Russia, and that as the fall of the in some ways of communism and then also the end of the Cold War, that it became more acceptable to say you had no religious preference and that you weren't necessarily saying something anti-American by claiming no religious preference. So maybe it just became more socially acceptable, and maybe there was a larger number of people that they would have identified as Christian, but if there weren't that social pressure, maybe they wouldn't have identified that way. But this number goes up over time. Here we see up to 2012, it's about 20%. It's climbed a bit more over time. The speed has slowed down a bit, but depending on what data you look at, something now probably like 25 to 30% of people have no religious preference. Here I'm just showing it by politics. So if you look at the percentage of people who are liberal or slightly liberal, moderate, or conservative, these are the percentage of people who have no religious preference over time. And there has been growth across groups, but it's very, a lot slower and less among conservatives, whereas among liberals, they are the people who are moving away from religious affiliation. And then here, if you look at generations, among a generation, sometimes there is a bit of an increase in having no religious affiliation over time. But in many ways, it's sort of what generation you were born into will determine whether you have no religious preference. And if you had a religious preference, at age 20, there's a very good chance you have a religious preference, kind of throughout the life course. I'm going to talk now a little bit about polarization. So this is a study that I did where we looked at the percentage of people within different religious categories over time. So there was a study that showed that on average, religion seemed to be declining in the United States, and they made the argument that America was following the pattern of Europe and other places that are secularizing. But we reanalyzed the data, and what we found was that there wasn't really a decline in strong affiliation. What there was a decline in people who said that they were not strongly affiliated. So, it went from, people who, if they were asked, do you have an affiliation, yes or no? And then is this a strong affiliation or a not strong affiliation? It was the not strong people that were declining while the no affiliation rises, and that strong affiliation in many ways was holding steady. So we called this the persistence of intense religion in the United States. You can see this on a variety of things. Prayer frequency actually went up a bit. So people who say they pray multiple times a day climbed a bit, whereas the people who pray sometimes declined, and praying less than once a week, including never, stayed about steady. So over time, there's been, in a sense, a dropping out of the middle, usually because of a decline in the people in the middle becoming, going to non-religious. But on prayer, and sometimes other types of spirituality measures, it's actually an increase in the highest frequency, and the bottom stays about the same, and then the middle declines. On attendance, people who attend multiple times a week is low but holding steady. The attend sometimes declines, the never attend goes up. So it's kind of an emptying out of the moderately religious. We see this on a variety of things. People who see the Bible as a literal word of God staying kind of steady. The people saying it's inspired but not literal declining, and people who see it as a book of fables going up. And this kind of can be seen across a wide variety of measures. The percentage of people who say they're evangelical holding about steady, whereas other types of affiliation besides evangelical Protestant are declining over time. And a lot of that decline is happening among mainline Protestants. Here I show what happens if you dichotomize this at different places. And so you could make it look like religion is going down or up depending on, what level of religion you're talking about. So if you're looking at the higher levels of religion, it tends to stay steady or go up. But if you look at these more moderate levels of religion as your dividing point, it then looks as though religion in the United States is on the decline. So I'm not saying that religion on average isn't on the decline in the United States, but I am just making the point that kind of the most intensely religious are holding about steady. And that I suspect that some of this is that some of the most religious people, and that combining with certain political stances, is pushing away some of the more moderately religious people who might have more liberal or moderate political views. Here we see the kind of the ways the United States continues to stand out. So among countries that might be considered similar to the US, the percentage that pray multiple times a day in the US was about 30%, whereas in other countries that could be considered in some ways maybe culturally or economically similar, this rate of frequent prayer is much lower. The rate of attending multiple times a week is lower, and the rate of believing the Bible as a literal word of God is much higher in the United States than elsewhere. So making the argument that the US stands out as having a high level of intense religion, and that intense religion holding kind of steady in a way that it does not in, say, Europe. And then here's just a figure showing the changes over time, and that what's happening in the US in many ways stands out, where intense religion is holding steady or even increasing in a way in the United States that it is not elsewhere. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the US standing out more generally. So some people make the argument that the United States is exceptional in some ways, and on religion, it does seem to be the case. So this is a figure from Pew Research Center. It shows basically the GDP of countries in relation to the percentage of people who say religion is very important in their lives. You can see that on average, places with low GDP, people say religion is very important in their lives. And places with higher GDP, there aren't as many people saying religion is important in their lives. And we see the US really kind of standing out here, where there's a lot of people who say religion is very important in their lives, despite having this high level of GDP. So in some ways, we could see the United States as being a bit different than some other places in terms of religion. So now I'm going to talk about, though, what is happening in the US. And then also, in many ways, this is, I think, a more global phenomenon where people are moving toward the idea of expressive individualism, people being able to express themselves in the way that they want and to have the identities that they believe that are important to them. So, for example, the rise in support, for example, for sexual minorities or other groups of people that might have been seen as not following an acceptable lifestyle in sometimes in history, but that now people are seeing more so that people should, in many ways, be able to be themselves, express themselves, and that the individual and who they are has this almost type of sacredness, and that going against who a person is in maybe going against the golden rule. So I'm going to talk a bit here now about the study where that figure that I showed you at the beginning comes from. We're making the argument that what is happening with religion in the United States is in many ways a social process, and it's people moving toward having questions about religious organizations, but not necessarily about faith. So this study tracks a group of young people, millennials. It follows them from the year 2003 to 2013, following them from middle school and high school into young adulthood, and seeing what happens with their religious identities, religious practices over time. To give away the point, religious identities, religious affiliations, things about organized religion are on the decline, but people tend to maintain and sometimes actually increase things that we might think of as more like spirituality or individual faith, separate from organizations. And I'll highlight here that a lot of this seems to be among younger generations having concerns about institutions stifling self-actualization, marginalizing sexual minorities, constraining women, demonstrating hypocrisy. So if they see, maybe a televangelist is, maybe embezzling money, or they see that, their pastor says to love everyone, but then the religion, might not seem loving to some people, that sometimes people, to continue following the golden rule, they end up following that golden rule right outside the church doors. It doesn't necessarily mean they become atheists, but they oftentimes have questions or issues with organized religion. So here's the figure again, just to remind you, the more linear versus the more circular approach. So we talk about this idea of breaking free of the iron cage. There's this classic sociological idea that society through modernization has become more rational, bureaucratic, and institutionalized, and that this acts almost as an iron cage where we're trapped into the bureaucracy in which life exists. That policies and regulations and rules and large organizations control a lot of aspects of life. It used to be maybe you farmed a land in a place and maybe there were some rules, but you kind of did your own thing to an extent. Whereas now there's all these large bureaucratic rules, organizations, maybe zoning codes. And so you can't just kind of do anything anymore. The Wild West is over. Life is a bureaucracy in some ways. People now basically then are starting to take issue with this. So they have concerns about the ways that, say, large organizations or institutions trying to control their life, trying to tell them what to do. They're having a lot of kind of pushback against this sort of thing. And I'm making the argument that people's pushback against organized religion is, yes, in part about religion, but that it's also in part about the organizations more generally. So people are moving away from doing things as a part of an institution and doing things more individually. So for example, there's this classic book called Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam, and he talked about the bowling alone analogy fits a broader thing in society where he said people used to bowl in bowling leagues and now they go bowling by themselves. And so there's a movement away from people participating in, say, Kiwanis Club or maybe their union or other types of institutions, and they're kind of wanting to do things more on their own, even as society still continues to bureaucratize in some ways where you can't just go out and do anything you want. There's a lot of rules and regulations. If you want to try to start a business, you can't just go, say, hey, I've got a business, I'm going to sell things. There's a lot of rules and policies you need to follow to do something like that. So Max Weber posited the idea that there was a rationalist spirit that had achieved a momentum of its own. So through modernization, and he would have talked about like industrialization of society, that society is just going to keep rationalizing and systematizing, and some of the enchantment of life goes away. He would say that under capitalism, the rationalist bureaucratic order became this iron cage that, absent some sort of change or revival, would imprison humanity indefinitely and potentially irreversibly, where your life would basically be controlled by large institutions and organizations. He also made the argument that the enchantment and the vibrancy and the spirituality and the supernatural ideas of religion would, in a sense, go away. And religious organizations would become, just hierarchies, bureaucracies, policymakers, people getting together to vote on things and come up with a budget rather than people living out their faith. And that over time, that as the enchantment of religion goes away, and it just becomes this organization, that people would then become less interested in it. That a large part of why people would find religion important and meaningful in their lives is that it, speaks to something bigger than themselves. And that, if religion just becomes another board meeting, that people would eventually lose interest in it. So in the study here, we take this iron cage argument back to religion. People had talked about it more about economics and bureaucracy, but here we're talking about the bureaucracy that often emerges with religion. So religions can become increasingly institutional. In some ways, they have to become a little institutionalized to survive. So if there's some charismatic leader who starts a movement, after that person dies, if their ideas don't get written down in some way, they don't get systematized, they don't get organized, if no organization and community arises around this, it kind of dies off over time. So some institutionalization is necessary for a group to continue over time. But if the institutionalization kind of becomes more important than the liveliness and the faith that was the reason to institutionalize, the idea would be that people would lose interest. So we're making the case in this particular study that individualization prompted by broader societal individualization and autonomy shaped by the 1960s countercultural movement and other things, that there was a championing of individual rights and self-actualization, that as these things changed, that people's approach to religion started to become also more individualized and personalized, and people want more of like a DIY approach. So, do it yourself. They want to, have their own personal relationship with God. We could even think about the Protestant Reformation as an example of this, where the Catholic Church was perceived as becoming overly bureaucratic and as losing the purpose of what they were all about. And that over time, people took issue with this, and that Martin Luther, created the Protestant Revolution to get away from some of this bureaucracy. But then if we see what happens over time, then an organization then arises around Martin Luther, and then we have Lutheranism. Then we have a new group that says, we need to get back to the original faith tradition, and they break off from Lutheranism because maybe they see it as too systematic and organized and bureaucratic. So there's this kind of cycle of reformations where people want to get back to the more personally meaningful and authentic and, their own personal relationship with God, rather than having, their relationship being with an institution or organization. We could make the case, and this is what I argue, is that a lot of changes in religion are essentially a silent revolution against the rationalization, bureaucratization, and politicization of religion. So if we think about people who take issue with an organization, so perhaps we could use Adventism as an example, there's a lot of people who just kind of quietly fall away, and they start maybe they're saying, I don't know about, some of the bureaucracy and hierarchy here. Maybe I'm going to start, maybe donating my money to like ADRA or something like this. And then they're like, what? I don't know about this organization. I'm going to start, donating to things that I find more personally meaningful. And so there becomes people kind of just quietly disengaging, or maybe changing where they give their tithe or offerings to things that they see as less bureaucratic and less hierarchical, and maybe more personally meaningful and impactful. So people are walking out of organized religions and going back to the dynamic, diverse, and syncretic forms of faith traditions before the more rationalized, systematized, and institutionalized religion that was invented in modernity. So there's this idea in religious studies that what we see now and think of as religion isn't what historical religion was like, that it was kind of created through kind of trying to understand and study and systematize religion, that we then saw religion as the institutions and the organizations, instead of maybe the cultural traditions, the faith values. We could think about, some religious organizations trying to stamp out what they saw as paganism and trying to be more systematic and rational over time. And a lot of this happened in modernity, but we could now see people trying to go back. We could think about this within Adventism, where someone might say, I have challenges and issues with the hierarchy, but I still believe in the faith tradition. I still believe in the Bible. I still believe in Ellen White. So what then maybe a person, starts practicing from home, or maybe they still attend their congregation, but, they might not quite identify as Adventist anymore. Or they might say, I'm sort of Adventist, but, really I'm trying to follow Jesus. So sometimes people are trying to go back to the more pre-organized forms. Um, I gave you a quote from a book that came out in 1985. It was by a group of sociologists. The Robert Bellah was the lead author. He's a sociologist of religion. They went out and talked to a lot of Americans. The subtitle, it's Habits of the Heart, and then the subtitle is Individualism and Commitment in American Life. And they were trying to get a sense of how do people find meaning and purpose and build community in America. And this book came out in 1985, and here's a quote from it. Individualism lies at the very core of American culture. We believe in the dignity, indeed the sacredness of the individual. Anything that would violate our rights to think for ourselves, judge for ourselves, make our own decisions, live our lives as we see fit, is not only morally wrong, but sacrilegious. Our highest and noblest aspirations, not only for ourselves, but for those we care about, for our society, and for the world, are closely linked to our individualism. So this is a kind of American value of really caring about the right of people to live as they want, to be the type of person that they want to be, and kind of live and let live. And they were showing that in the 1980s, this was an idea that was increasingly taking hold. And the group of young people we studied were born in the late 80s in this world where this type of idea had taken on. And the further we go in this direction, the more people start to move away from some types of organizations and institutions, and in some ways wanting to do things their own way. So again, here was this more linear process and this argument that people made that this is what happens with religion. And I'm making the case that it's this more circular approach, and that in some ways, the more organized and systematized religion becomes, the more people start to question it. So we could think about kind of an ebb and a flow here, where let's say Adventism, starts to feel more authoritarian, or it starts to feel more bureaucratic, more systematized and rationalized. Maybe some of the dynamism and the faith of it seems lost. People then want to push back against that. And we could think then about some individuals maybe leaving Adventism, or maybe a change in the way Adventism operates. And maybe there's a change in power, and people then maybe want to move back toward getting back to what they see it as all about, and getting back to Jesus, getting back to the ideas of the movement, and then kind of shifting away from emphasizing and focusing on the institutions and the organizations of it all. So here is from that study where we tracked young people over time. We followed them from 2003 to 2013, and it's among the same people. So here we can see among this group that on this scale we're looking at, prayer and attendance were both quite high among young people. So this was people aged 13 to 17. After the course of 10 years, prayer seems to, kind of decline a bit, but then actually pick back up. But we can see that attendance is just really dropping. So as young people grow up, as they move away from home, they might be maintaining their prayer life, but they're not attending religious services like they used to, perhaps with their parents. So, the kid moves away from home, they're still praying, but they're not attending services necessarily. Here's the patterns for religious affiliation and belief in God. And this is about certain belief in God. So at the beginning of the study, there was actually more people who affiliated with a religion than who had a certain belief in God. So we could imagine maybe some of these people were affiliated with religion, and maybe they believed in God, but they were not totally certain about it. But here we can see that religious affiliation is just rapidly declining. So it was almost 90% among these 13 to 17-year-olds. By the time they're 23 to 27, it's about 60%, just a little over. So we see this about a third decline in the percentage of people who are religiously affiliated. But belief in God doesn't really go down. It dips a little and then it goes back up. And so the people are still believing in God, but they're not necessarily wanting to affiliate with organized religion. Here we can see belief in proselytization and meditation, and then meditation practice. So this we could see as doing religion in a way where you tell others what to do versus doing a thing that's very personal and that you're not necessarily telling anyone else or even practicing with anyone else. So we see here that the belief that it's okay to proselytize and tell other people what to believe, or even just to do evangelism, has declined among this group from about 60% to about 50%. But then the percentage of people who meditate has gone up from a little above 10 to around 20. So there's almost a doubling in the percentage of people who are meditating. So we can see that people in many ways are moving away from organized religion or religion that tells others how to live. And people are moving more toward individual and personal practice, things that they find personally meaningful, things that they find authenticity in, but not really wanting to be a part of religion. Now I'm going to show you the patterns on attendance and affiliation by political views. So we can see here that at the beginning of the study, that the frequency of attendance and also religious affiliation starts out fairly similar. Yes, the conservatives are a little bit more, but they're, the liberals, moderates, and conservative kids, they're all kind of attending, they're all affiliated. But if we look over time, the liberals especially are dropping away. So as these kids go from adolescence into adulthood, it's the liberal ones who are not attending services as much and are not affiliating with religion, though there is decline among everyone as well. It's just that there's kind of this widening of the politics gap. So we could think about this as religion maybe not really appealing to or feeling like a place for people who are liberal. Here are the trajectories by views on same-sex marriage. So among people who say same-sex marriage should be legal, we see a much faster drop in attendance and affiliation. So it seems like this view about personal authenticity and self-expression and people being able to live their lives as they see fit, that the people who support gay rights are moving away from religion much faster than those who do not. And then this is by views on abortion. So again, the people that support abortion rights are moving away from religion more quickly than other people. So in addition to the quantitative data, there's also qualitative data from this study. So there was the young people were also interviewed and asked questions rather than just given these closed-ended survey items. They were allowed to talk about their lives, and they were followed over time. So there was 4 sets of interviews with the different young people. So they would first get interviewed, when they were in middle school or high school, and then they would get continued to be interviewed over time. The key patterns from the qualitative data are these. I'll read them to you, and then I'm going to show you some illustrative quotes. So the themes that arise, it seems to be that institutional religious declines actually occurs among those with strong religious socialization. So if someone's parents are telling them to be quite religious and raising them to be quite religious, it's actually those people who sometimes decline the most. Some of this could be that they have room to decline. So if someone's parents don't raise them to be religious, they can't really become less religious over time because they didn't start anywhere. But we could also think about that if parents were a little perceived to be overly strict in the way that they did religious socialization, that sometimes there was a bit of a reaction against that, where kids would not want to stay if they were socialized with too much intensity of religion. Movement away from institutional religion isn't necessarily something that people just fall away from because they're bored or lazy or something like this. Oftentimes, it's people making choices to follow their values as they develop autonomous identities and resolve cognitive dissonance. So we had a number of people who said, I have a gay friend. My pastor says they're going to hell. I don't know what to do with this. Over time, a lot of those people end up moving away from religion. And also some of them too, the young people themselves were gay or bisexual. Their pastors told them they were going to hell. Those people are much more likely to then leave organized religion. Sometimes there was conflict people experienced with strict or hypocritical or politicized institutions. And then the people that are kind of the leaders and apologists for those institutions. So people would talk about maybe religious leaders or others being strict or overly concerned with money or being abusive, and that would then lead people away from being affiliated. And a lot of people actually, it takes losing the institutionalized religion to find their individual faith and spirituality. So some people would actually become more committed to their values, more invested in their practices, actually as they left the institutions and kind of forged their own path with faith and spirituality. So I'll tell you a little bit about Chris. So Chris experienced a strong Catholic upbringing as an adolescent. And this is a pseudonym. So not that anyone, knows this person, but if you happen to know someone named Chris who fits exactly these things, this person's name is not actually Chris. Chris experienced a strong Catholic upbringing as an adolescent. He said he was very religious and predicted he would be very involved at 25. So when he was first interviewed at 15, he was asked, how religious do you think you're going to be later on? And he predicted that, he would be very religious. But over time, things changed. He became frustrated with what the church said about LGBTQ rights, the scandals it was embroiled in, and how they always seemed to be asking for money. Here's a quote from Chris. I used to go to church and mass all the time. I was born and raised Catholic. When I went to medical school, I went to mass up there the first year and a half solid. And then I decided not to go. I was tired of going to church and hearing about politics. So he got sick of going to church and it not being about faith, it not being about spirituality, it not being about his relationship with God, but that at church they just kept talking about politics, politics, politics. He got sick of it. Every sermon at the Catholic Church was about how we can't let the gays get married. They can't raise children. God save the kids, I said to the padre, for a church that says they're accepting, we pride ourselves on being holier than thou, you guys are pretty discriminatory, and I don't appreciate it. I used to love coming to church, but I don't anymore. It's because every time I come here, you tell me who I should be and who can do this and who can do that. And this really connects back to this idea of individual autonomy, of individualism and individual self-expression, that people want to be able to be themselves and for other people to be able to be themselves and to not have an institution tell them, the person you are is unacceptable. He also wasn't just concerned about how the church treated gay people and others. He also got sick of that. It seemed like they seemed pretty focused on money and bureaucracy. So I got tired of them asking for money. Every church I went to, they would ask me for money. And I told Father, I finally got up and left mid-sermon one day. I just walked out and I said, you know what? I'm done. I can't come to church and I can't listen to people ask for money every time. So he basically got sick of when he would go, they would talk about politics and then they would ask him for money. And what he wanted was something more edifying, something that would build him up spiritually, that would speak to his faith and allow him to experience his connection to God and the divine, and to have it be more meaningful than hearing about politics or asking about money. I just think the politics of the church have really turned me off of it. Not so much what it stands for, but I mean, it's just corrupt. The politics and the scandals. You hear about it every day. People ask me to identify, and I say, born and raised Catholic, but not now. But I believe that there is something, whether you want to call it God or not. So it's not that he's become an atheist. It's not that he would not consider the spiritual realm. It's that he's become fed up with the organization that he is perceiving as corrupt. The Catholic Church has had a lot of scandals, other religions as well. And for Chris, it just didn't make sense anymore to attend and participate and give money to an organization that for him seemed more concerned about, making rules and telling people what to do and asking for money than about promoting his faith. Here's another respondent. I'll give you a couple of other examples. I'm not going to give you all of Faye's story, but I'm just going to give you this quote from Faye. She said, sometimes I don't really feel as though church is needed. I don't think it's a requirement to be connected with God. The religious aspect of everything is not appealing to me. It's overly structured. And I think that sometimes that structure can get in the way of worship. Sometimes I look at religion as a business and I don't want to look at it as a business. I would rather look at it as a personal relationship with God. So I think the spirituality part of it is more my thing, not the business aspect. I don't like the organization. So we could think about how people relate to different aspects of their faith. And for some people, the organization is almost acting as a barrier. It's seeming like a business. It's seeming like it's focused on structure, on money, on rules, and that they want to have a more personal and individually authentic relationship with God. We can almost think of this as illustrating the types of things that come through with almost any religious reformation, that, a religious leader comes along and challenges what they perceive as overly bureaucratic or overly focused on money. We could think of these quotes as not being unlike the story of Jesus turning the tables in the temple, that he didn't like that it had seemed to become a business. He didn't like that it had become about money, and he wanted to get back to personal relationship with God. Here's a quote from Ava. I'm not a supporter of institutionalized religion. For me, that means a loss of integrity. Because I think we all think differently. And if you are really just, giving decisions and things like that to some other being, I think that takes a little bit of your individuality away. So here we see her even using the types of words that we were theorizing were important, and this respondent said the literal things that she doesn't like the institution and she wants to be able to have her individuality and her relationship with God. I'm going to give you a little bit of a quote from James Baldwin. We could almost see what is happening with young people today and turning away from organized religion as them following Baldwin's exhortation. He wrote this in 1962. In the realm of power, Christianity has operated with unmitigated arrogance and cruelty. In the realm of morals, the role of Christianity has been, at best, ambivalent. It is not too much to say that whoever wishes to become a truly moral human must first divorce himself from all the prohibitions, crimes, and hypocrisies of the Christian church. If the concept of God has any validity or use, it can only be to make us larger, freer, and more loving. If God cannot do this, it is time we got rid of him. So he's not, necessarily talking about Christianity as a faith tradition. He's talking about the Christian church, about the organization, the things that it has done throughout history, and is basically saying that if we want to have an authentic faith, if we want to be good people, we need to separate ourselves from, and these are in his words, the prohibitions, crimes, and hypocrisies of the church. So I'm going to talk now a little bit about traditional church sect theory. You may or may not have heard about church sect theory before. This is a point at which I'm shifting from talking more about individuals and what individual people are doing to then thinking about what happens with organizations over time. So in traditional church sect theory, there's the general idea that groups start out as separate, as new religious movements, or what some people might call cults, that they become kind of more established over time. They start to integrate with society, and eventually they become churches or denominations. So they move from this new religious movement to this sectarian group, then on to being kind of just another recognized denomination. And so, yeah, it follows this order of from cult to sect to denomination. And that this is basically the path that all religious groups follow. But I'm going to talk a little bit about how this isn't necessarily always a one-way movement, and that sometimes groups will move back and forth along this continuum. And we could think about things as more circular, as cyclical, as an ebb and flow. If we think about, where does Adventism fit within this? Is Adventism a sect, or is Adventism a denomination? It might kind of matter when we're looking, what version of Adventism we're looking at, and where we are looking at. So the traditional approach to this theory thought to be about institutionalization and settling down of ideas and reduced fervency. So the idea is that over generations, there's more assimilation. So maybe the first generation, really is fervent. They're separate from society. Their kids want to kind of become more like the other people around them. We could connect this even to theories about immigration, that a first generation immigrant coming to a new place has their own views, they're different. Then they have kids, those kids are more integrated and similar to the society around them. Then those people have kids. And then, once we get to something like the fourth generation, there might not really be as much of a distinction between the people who immigrated from this other country and the people that have just been here. So if we think about this with religions and church sect theory, the idea could be that as a group basically settles down and gets institutionalized, and as new generations come along, they become more similar to other groups around them. So groups that were more distinctive and separatist start to look like other people. There's this idea called regression to the mean, that anything that is distinctive is hard to necessarily maintain over time. So we could think about this as just heights. So if someone is 7 foot tall, they have a child. Their child is probably going to be taller than the average person. But if someone is 7 feet tall, that is so distinctive that it is in many ways hard to kind of maintain that difference. And so the 7 foot person, has a kid who's 6'9". The person who's 6'9" has a kid who's 6'5". And eventually people go back more toward the mean. So there's a movement toward the average. And so anything that's extreme is hard to maintain. And so the idea here would be that if your religious group is very different from other people, that it's hard to maintain that difference if you're existing within a society. and you start to move toward what other people are like around you. So you might maintain difference. You might still be taller than other people, but that 7 feet tall probably isn't around anymore. Same with a new religious movement. There might have been people willing to, sell all their possessions because they think that, that Miller was right and that Jesus is coming and that our farms don't matter anymore. So we sell them off. The next generation might not have exactly that fervency. They might definitely believe in a second coming. They might have, they might really hold on to the ideas of the Advent, but they, might not have the exact fervency. And then those people have kids, those people have kids. And then people start to look like the society around them. So church sect theory would basically say that as a religion exists longer, it starts to look a little bit more like the society in which it exists. Sometimes this is about people who were more separate and disenfranchised, ending up with education, incomes, and other characteristics more like the society they're in. So we could think about different groups and their approach to things. We could think about, I attended Walla Walla University, and I remember hearing stories about how some of their early buildings weren't built to last. They were built to last, just maybe a couple of decades, and it wasn't thought that they would need to have a building 100 years later. But over time, they started to, see themselves as more like a standard educational institution. Not that they weren't still distinct, but, we need our buildings to last. We're not going to build buildings that only last 20 years. We're going to get regular accreditation so the people in our group, can maybe go on to grad school or get certain types of jobs. So as the people in the group start to just sort of become like the people around them, as they, have more institutionalization, we could even think about Adventism and the establishment of institutions of like the education system, the medical system, that these then lead to people becoming more middle class than perhaps people used to be in the religion originally. And as people become more middle class, they oftentimes are more committed to and integrated within the societies they're operating within. So if someone is a medical doctor and, is working in an Adventist hospital or maybe even a non-Adventist hospital, they are going to, in many ways, operate like other doctors. Adventism, too, has shifted in the way it does medicine from a kind of more distinctive and separate approach to, following a lot of the standards of quote unquote modern medicine. So with generational change, more second, third, and higher generation members, and fewer new converts. So initially, when there's a lot of new converts tend to be fervent. The kids of those converts don't necessarily have the same fervency that their parents had. But Adventism looks a little different from some groups if you look at the distribution of Adventists. So a lot of times with a lot of groups, the people at the beginning are all new. And then in the third, second, fourth generations, there aren't as many converts anymore. But Adventism, as a faster growing group, has more new people coming in. And so, we don't just have these, third and fourth generation and fifth generation Adventists. I think I'm a fifth generation Adventist. This is not what all Adventists are. A lot of people are still converting in the US, but then especially globally, that if we think about the distribution of who is the prototypical Adventist globally, it's probably, a first or second generation Adventist in a developing nation. So Adventism has been situated within this church sect theory framework, but the argument that that we're working on, and a lot of this comes from ideas that Ron Lawson's been working with a long time. We don't want to just think about this as a simple, straightforward process where, Adventism just moves from new religious movement to sectarian group to denomination. With global expansion, continued growth, many new converts, especially in some regions, and these regions have become a larger percentage of the church. So if we think about the decision-making power of the church, where Adventists are located, it's not something where, we just have all of these fifth and sixth generation Adventists in the United States. The typical Adventist might be someone who converted within the last 10 years. There's ebbs and flows from institutionalization and the fervency of a new religious movement. there's continued tensions between integration and separation, progressivism and traditionalism. So if we think globally, Adventists in the United States might say, hey, we should ordain women. It's what other groups do. We should care about this. This is a rights issue. But this might be, there might be a different perspective somewhere else. And if we think about the different tensions between groups, like a lot of times more recent converts were converted by people who were evangelists. And we might think of evangelists as maybe being some of the more fervent people. And so the more fervent version gets spread, and then new people join. And then in some ways, we maintain some of this the fervency of a new religious movement, even as in many ways there's institutionalization. We could also think about pendulum swings within the changes in leadership that have occurred in Adventism. So if we think about the religious leaders over time and the presidents of the church, we might have maybe a more progressive swing, then maybe we have a more traditionalist swing, and sometimes this goes back and forth. And so at sometimes Adventism tries to be more separate and sectarian and different from society. And then maybe at other times, Adventists want to integrate more and work with others more and, still be distinctive, but, maybe work along with other groups that might be similar or promoting values that might be seen as more, maybe typical of other groups. I see a hand is raised.
I think folks are just getting ready for when it's time for them.
Oh, they're just preparing for discussion. We're getting there.
Yeah.
Okay. So like I said, we're definitely getting there. So here's the conclusion of what I'm saying, and then here's the discussion I want to have. Some of this is, things that you all may know just as well, if not better than me. And I'm going to be excited to hear and learn from all of you. So what I've been talking about and this shift from, new religious movement to sect to denomination, especially in relation to Adventism, is ideas I'm thinking about, and others with me, especially Ron Lawson, he's the leader of the project. These are things we're thinking about and still considering. We're drafting this, we're working on a project here. So we're curious to know, I'm curious to know what you all think. I try to teach in an interactive way when I teach courses because I feel like sometimes my students can teach me more than I can teach them. And so I'm going to be very excited to hear what you all say. So here are some of the things that I'm going to be, curious to hear what you think, but also happy to talk about anything. So here's the general argument, and this argument is still, it's not like it's written in stone, it can't be adjusted. And this is the argument I've been thinking about. Religious groups transform along a continuum from sect to denomination, and sometimes back again, as they respond to cultural pressures, institutional challenges, and global expansion. The Adventist tradition exemplifies these dynamics. Emerging from the ashes of the Great Depression, the Great Disappointment, it became a global movement marked by institutional reach and theological tension. Its trajectory resists linear classification, with members in different regions pulling toward professional integration or apocalyptic separation. The cyclical perspective arguably helps explain contemporary religious paradoxes. So this is the idea that I laid out from that other study. The collapse of moderate religion, the persistence and growth of intense religion, and the rise of spiritual individualism. While affiliation declines in many places, fervent religious expression endures and even intensifies in others. So here I'm talking more about some of the individual religion things rather than about the church sect theory. Meanwhile, young adults increasingly reject institutional religion while embracing values rooted in authenticity, equality, and the sacredness of the individual. These trends raise questions, and these are some things that we could talk about, but I'm happy to hear other things too. Can global religious movements remain cohesive amid cultural divergence and rising individual autonomy? How do institutions adapt or resist as members demand more flexibility and personal resonance? I think understanding religious change as cyclical and multi-directional rather than linear or inevitable offers a framework for making sense of faith's past, present, and future, possible futures, and I'm excited to discuss with you. And just to remind you, here's the more linear approach versus this more circular approach. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I will be curious to hear the conversation here.
Thank you, Landon. That was very interesting. I have a couple questions just before we get started with the raised hands, and one of them was, for the graphs that you had showing the decline of different groups and in participation in religions, I wondered if you had one that dissected it, male, female, and LGBT.
Yeah, this is a great question. So I'm working on a book right now about gender and religion and some of these changes over time. Typically, and this is more so among Christians than some other groups, women tend to be more religious than men, but the patterns actually tend to be similar in terms of their change over time, traditionally. But in newer generations, there seems to be possibly a new trend emerging where women used to be more religious than men, but also, women tend to be more politically progressive and men tend to be more conservative. And it seems like among emerging generations, it's possible that we might see men actually being more religious than women, in part out of, lining up with their politics. Then if we think about LGBTQ folks, definitely there's faster decline. If someone is gay, they're much more likely to move away from organized religion. But I think that, it's not just, them wanting to move away, but sometimes them being pushed away. And I think it can sometimes be hard for someone who's LGBTQ to stay, like that they're swimming upstream in order to stay and to participate. So definitely LGBTQ people are moving away more quickly than heterosexual people. But on gender, women have tended to be more religious than men. We see declines among both. But it seems like in kind of just the last few years, and as there's been a new political climate in the United States, that there may be kind of a movement toward men participating a little bit more than women.
I had another question, and that is just based on your studies. I don't know the answer to this question. When a person is baptized into the Adventist church, it's typically not only do you accept Jesus as your savior, but you become a member of the church. Are there other churches who have that same policy where you're not just accepting Jesus as your savior, you're actually claiming membership?
Yeah, this is a great point. We could think about, what is a baptism and what is the purpose and function? And sometimes it's maybe both at the same time, that a person is, expressing and experiencing their relationship with Jesus, but that same thing is also, putting them on the books in a new way. And so there's definitely other groups where, the baptism might be the defining factor of whether someone is considered a member. I think, a lot of times when someone gets baptized, probably they are at least at that time okay with the organization that they're joining. But I think that then sometimes they might fall away. Sometimes, in Adventism, like I'm trying to remember, I think I was 12 years old when I got baptized. That's a point where, you have your beliefs and your values, but you can end up shifting and changing quite a bit over time. So, showing graphs from that one study where we were following people from age 13 to 17 to ages 23 to 27. And a lot of times people move away. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of those people are still on the books. If we thought about, who is on the official rolls of Adventism, I don't know how many of the people who have, moved away from institutional involvement have bothered to, write their home church and say, hey, please remove me from your books. So I suspect that the joining and the baptism, the organization and the relationship with Jesus tend to go together, but that in the falling away that, someone might not necessarily, write up the bureaucratic forms they need to fill out or something to remove their names from the books.
Thanks for that. I'm going to go to Jeremy and Bjorn. Go ahead.
Yeah, it was my question. I asked Jeremy if he wanted to. He doesn't have a question right now, but thank you very much, Landon. This is really, really fascinating. So I've said many times at ATSS, I grew up a missionary kid, and then after that, I was a digital nomad. It was after the Andrews days, and so traveled a lot. And I've always tried, as my mentor, Dr. Russell here, encouraged us to do at Andrews. I think he said that a mentor of his said it's very important to go to church every Sabbath. Like whatever you do, however, wherever you are on the spectrum of Adventist belief, try to be connected to a church. So I've tried to do that. And I feel like I've seen the cult version of Adventism, the sectarian version, and the very kind of denominational, almost like mainstream kind of expression in these different parts of the world. And they all exist at the same time. Like where I see the shift happening is away from kind of American Adventism. So, and that I think is very confusing for people in the global north, because we're used to this kind of sticking out your neck, very bold, countercultural kind of approach to things, where we're just going to. It is almost individualistic, that form of Adventism, certainly driven by very strong personalities at the beginning, to where now we are becoming a more top-down structure of a church. It's very bureaucratic. It's very strongman oriented from leadership point of view, and that is disorienting for the Western world, for the global North, and is really discouraging to a lot of people in congregations. So I guess I'm wondering what your thoughts are going into election season, basically general conference session, like how that might influence things, this growing trend towards bureaucracy and top-down thinking, and also how, what is there any good news here? I mean, for me, it's always the local congregation. Like, I feel like going to Newbold, for example, I feel like I'm connected on a weekly basis, and therefore I survive these ups and downs. But yeah, how do you think we should be thinking about this shift towards away from American Adventism to a more top-down approach that seems to be happening?
Yeah. There's some great points in that, and I think that they raise important issues and questions. Some of these maybe don't have a clear answer, but I can speculate here. I think the point you make is excellent about that these all exist at once. So Adventism has kind of the new religious movement type of congregations and groups and movements. It has the sectarian, it has the denominational. And we can see regional variations. So we can imagine in the United States and especially maybe Western and Northern Europe, we see the more denominational Adventism. And that's where people in those groups maybe want things to be moving. But then Adventism might not be growing in those places as much as it is in some of the places that have the greater fervency. And so then if we think about a more democratic approach where, the number of people shapes, the outcomes, it's going to be the places that are growing and having more people that will, on average, have greater influence on the direction of things. Now, there could be continuing denominational movements in those places. So, in those places, there will increasingly be, second, third, fourth generation Adventists. But if we think about, the immediate moment, it's hard to say, and a lot of this is it's hard to have a form where all the people are going to be happy, because there's going to be all these different versions. I think the local congregation is where a lot of people personally experience Adventism, but I've attended Adventist churches in a lot of different places, and then also different congregations in the same town. And even though it's all Adventism, it's all one community, it's also sometimes very different. You attend one congregation, then you attend this other one, and it almost feels like a different religion. Maybe in the one, they're not okay with women wearing pants, for example. And then in the other one, they would be shocked if, anyone tried to tell people what they could wear or not wear. And these places could exist 5 miles apart from each other. But then definitely once we have further distance, there's a lot of different versions of Adventism. My dad would travel for work a lot, and I would sometimes work with him traveling, and we'd attend Adventist congregations kind of all over the US. And it was always fascinating to see, sometimes you go to a congregation and there's 12 people and 9 of them are related to each other. And that's an Adventist church. Then, you go to, maybe one of the churches in one of the Adventist college towns, and there's just congregations with hundreds, if not, thousands of people. And the experience is just so different in terms of the culture, just, what the service looks like. And definitely these different versions of Adventism play out. And I think that, sometimes we see probably the larger congregations, especially in the West, tend to be the more denomination. The smaller tend to be maybe more sectarian. And then we could also see, differences across regions. So I think the question is, when people come together, what's the new vision that is going to take hold? I think that sometimes with politics, there's a pendulum where people are just frustrated with whoever did things last and they want to change things up. And so it could be that, Adventism has become too authoritarian, we need to change things up. And then it becomes, maybe more loose and free and open. And then, then people become frustrated with, and then they want to go back to, more bureaucratic. So, I suspect we could just see that maybe there's just, people sometimes just want to change things up, and it just swings back and forth every few years.
Well, I hope it's swinging the other way this time. Anyway,
We
thank
could
you very
also then
much.
think about, you know, I assume probably we have the more denominational Adventism present here. And so, yeah, there's probably other groups meeting right now that, you know, maybe say things have been too open and free and we need, you know, more structure. And so, yeah, all the different versions exist at once.
So true. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Bjorn, for your comments. Lauren, go ahead.
Yeah, I just thank you, Landon. This has been excellent. I just want to remind all of you that next week we have Dr. Malcolm Russell who's going to be speaking. Uh, Dr. Russell, do you have a moment to just tell us what you'll be talking about next week? I've asked you. There you
Yes.
go.
Well, here, I'll also video here. My key next week is a discussion of the book by Jonathan Haidt about the righteous mind. Haidt is originally a secular Jew from New York City, became an atheist. He's an evolutionary psychologist. Now, I'm not a psychologist, but I had a delightful opportunity to read The Righteous Mind and some other books with a group of students. And that's one of the great opportunities of teaching, when we can go to something that's not exactly a textbook, but is about the world out there. Anyway, Haidt gives explanations for why we do what we do, and for an evolutionary psychologist, he's come out with some ideas that really say religion is important, and he hints at the possibility that the desire to do good, or to have a sense of what is right and wrong, may be innate. So that's where I'll be next week.
Looking forward to it. And by the way, we do the announcement of next week's and the description of that on Wednesday. So I'll get a couple hundred words from Dr. Russell this week, and so you'll have a chance to catch up. Landon, I'm very Adventist. My family goes back to at least great grandparents, and one line possibly great great grandparents, as far as I know. Grew up in a fairly, well, I would say very strong Adventist family. Went to Adventist school, became a pastor, and find myself at the end of my career as a pastor being best described as what I think quite a few people in this group would describe themselves as cultural Adventists. The sense that I was raised with, that we were in the only true church, somewhere along the line became not helpful anymore. And I have one friend who isn't here today, but I wish he were. He said, I quit going to church after I left college. He said, I worked my entire lifetime with people who weren't Seventh-day Adventists, and yet I would tell you at this point that I cannot escape the church. It's still part of me. I'm still part of it. It's strong in me. Most of my friends that I feel most comfortable with are either Adventists or, like me, ex-Adventists, he says. And he says, I don't really know where to land. I've never really fit in to the world that I've lived in, because at this point, he calls himself an atheist. He said, I'm still an Adventist. So talk to us a little bit about this phenomena of the durability of this culture among us, if you would, please.
Yeah, this is a great point. So if we think about religion and religious identity, there's a lot of aspects that I think sometimes people assume they just all go together. but someone can believe in the beliefs, but not in the institution. Someone can see themselves as a part of the community, but then not hold the beliefs. Someone can be in the institution, in the community, and have the beliefs. So, all of these things often do go together, but then they are also distinct. And so we could think about like the Adventism as a culture. We could think about Adventism as a community. We could think about Adventism as an organization. We could think about Adventism as a set of beliefs. And, someone might be just in the community and none of the other stuff. I think that we can make the comparison in some ways to cultural Judaism, where this has been long seen as a way to be Jewish, that you're a part of the community, you're a part of the people, but that the beliefs might not be, the center part of what that is. Maybe you have questions. I'm working on a project now about the hiding of religious doubts, and it's interesting that it's not just atheists that hide religious doubts. Actually, the people that hide doubts the most are believers who are more doubting believers. So they spend time with a lot of people, and I think that there's sometimes, as a community, people just choose almost a pluralistic ignorance, where we ignore the fact that we might have a lot of different views on, say, Ellen White. So you get 10 Adventists together, you might have 20 different views on Ellen White. And sometimes people just choose to take a quote and use it and talk about Ellen White and not bring up all the ways that they disagree about what exactly that means. And so I think that sometimes people as a community just choose, we're going to get along, we're going to be together, maybe we're going to eat some veggie meat and go on a hike on Sabbath afternoon. And all of those people choose to get along in a way that they don't necessarily have to all believe the same thing. I think that oftentimes, when there's what gets called more as a strict religion, where religion has a lot of specific rules about beliefs and behavior, that sometimes these get really reinforced, especially when it's more sectarian or the new religious movement approach. But then we could think about groups like Unitarian Universalists, where it's basically like we're a community and we almost don't share any beliefs except for maybe having shared values of caring about other people, for example. And so, we could then think about that there could be more people moving toward, I want to be a part of the community, but maybe not the organization. And I think that would be a common, expected trajectory for a lot of people, especially in, say, the United States, where they choose to be Adventist more in terms of the people around them than in terms of, agreeing with everything the institution says. And I think that what's interesting about local congregations is they are both an organization, but also a community. And I think a lot of people participate in them more for the community than for the organization. And we see this sometimes when, say, maybe the higher ups want to remove an individual pastor, but the local people love that pastor. And we see the distinction between like the community of people living together versus like the institutional organizational structure. And those can definitely be in tension.
I remember thinking about this when we had an academy here in Ohio, and there were people who would attend the academy reunion who never came to church. And I always was amazed at that. Like, a third of the people there were loving the academy reunion and part of it, but they wouldn't come to my church. And it kind of annoyed me a little bit. Why don't you come to church? I'm not sure I understand it.
Dr. Johnston, you've been very patient here. I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Yes.
And share your thoughts with us. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Schnabel, for what you're doing. I have 3 short questions. Number 1, in the United States, is politics replacing religion? It certainly has an increasingly religious taste about it. Number 2, is Dean Kelly still relevant? And number 3, is the decline of institutional religion making more room for Jim Jones and David Koresh?
Yeah, these are great questions. Is politics replacing religion? I think that it's hard to say exactly, because in some ways religion is becoming politics. rather than politics becoming religion, and that they're becoming apart one and the same. I think there's an increasing number of people who are politically conservative who then express religious identity, but that may or may not engage in practice. So I'll try to keep things like in the abstract and not, but I'm going to reference some examples where, people might wonder, is Trump personally religious? He might, hold up a Bible, he might meet with pastors, but then, is he personally religious? And then we might then wonder, is politics and religion even separable at this point? Could someone express a religious identity, but have that almost be about their politics than it is about actually personal faith? We could then also think about the other way around, that people might have personal faith but not want to participate in organized religion because they feel that the organized religion options available to them don't match their values. So I think that rather than necessarily the one replacing the other, they've just become so intertwined that it sometimes becomes increasingly hard to separate out, is this religion or is this politics? Then this idea of, the decline of the rational and systematic institution, does this make, more room for the radical emergence of new movements? And I think in some ways, yes. I think that if people are fed up with like if we think about high church and low church, so high church tends to be more traditional, it tends to be more bureaucratic, it tends to be more professional and organized. Low church tends to be more, vibrant and less organized and hierarchical. Mainline Protestantism is the prototypical high church, along with Catholicism. And in many ways, it's the high church that's declining and the low church that has at one point actually increased and then kind of held more steady. So I think that as people become more frustrated with the more bureaucratic versions of religion, they look for the more vibrant versions. And it creates, I think, sometimes a space where there are people who can come in and kind of foment an amount of, I guess, like excitement or even just, we could think about populism, and if people are frustrated with institutions and organizations, it's sometimes easier to get people involved in something more radical. And so if, a David Koresh comes along and people are frustrated with the institution and he's able to appeal to the idea that I want to be able to have a more personal and vibrant experience, it may in some ways open a space for that. Though we might also imagine opening a space for the types of environments like the Second Great Awakening in the United States, where we had a lot of new religious movements emerge, including Adventism, where people were looking for something personally meaningful. So yeah, I think there's both more room for David Koresh, but also more room for other types of charismatic leaders. One thing I do wonder about is the old religion declining and going to be replaced by new forms of religion? And I think definitely, yeah, kind of a space opens up when people are frustrated with the current administration. They just want something different.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't know what happened to Gina here, but let me invite Clarence to join in.
Yes, Lauren, thank you. Well, thanks, Doctor, for this wonderful presentation. My question is very simple. Tell me, has Adventism peaked? Did it take us longer to move from 22 million to 23, as it did from 21 to 22? Have we gone to the top and are now on the other side of the hill or the mountain? Question.
Yeah. So I think one question we might wonder about is, how are these numbers measured in the first place? So I think we might wonder, how many people are on the books, but not really Adventist anymore? I think one of the ways we could grow fastest is only add people to the books and never remove them. And so, is Adventism growing? I think it is growing in many places. I don't know, in others. And then, in the United States, if we were to check with everyone who's on the rolls, are you Adventist still? I don't know, how many of them would say yes. And so I think a lot of this comes down to how we measure it. And so if we're thinking in numbers, I suspect Adventism will grow in terms of numbers over time. Will it grow as a percentage of global population? I don't know, because part of the growth could just be that the world population grows. I do think that a lot of Adventist approaches are about numbers. And I think that with that focus, there will be growth in numbers. I remember I took a seminary class that basically said how much it costs to convert someone in the US versus how much it costs to convert someone in a developing nation. And the math was to suggest we shouldn't even really bother with evangelism in the United States, because I think at the time it was costing $5,000 per person to convert somebody, and elsewhere it was, I don't know, $20. So, I think, is Adventism peaked? It depends on, are the numbers all that matters? How are the numbers measured? I suspect Adventism will grow over time, and it's in many ways one of the groups that is still growing, whereas a lot of others aren't.
Thank you.
Landon, can you explain why it seems that in the global South, Adventism is still so very strong?
Yeah, so there's a lot of places where I think that interest in religion is basically at, like, everyone is interested in religion. One thing I think a lot about is when evangelism happens, who is getting converted? So, if someone does an altar call, who is it that's coming to the front? Is it an atheist, or is it, a lapsed Adventist or a lapsed Lutheran? And, does an evangelistic series create more Christians? And that's, maybe hard to say sometimes. So there are some regions of the world where basically everyone is going to be religious. But then maybe because everyone's religious, some of the religious leaders don't bother, with the quality of the services they're providing and like the connections among the community. And if you go into a place that everyone's a member of the local church, but like no one actually likes the local church, that's probably a really easy place to evangelize. But you're just converting, people from Pentecostalism to Adventism. And so I think that is a part of where the growth is easier. And I think, the question would be is who are the people that are being converted? And some of it even too is just how far a dollar goes. And, if you, provide things to people, they might want to come if you're, offering free food. And free food might not cost very much in some places.
Yeah, well, exactly. It strikes me that one of the major things that has discouraged traditional Adventists like myself, who have a long history with this, is the concept that I and only I can be saved because I'm a Seventh-day Adventist. That doesn't sound solid anymore to a lot of us. Jeannie, your turn. Would you please join the conversation?
Hi, Lauren. Yeah, I totally agree with what you just said. I don't have anything too exciting or profound to add, but as I'm listening to this presentation, which I have thoroughly enjoyed and always been so interested in this topic, ever since, was it in the 80s when they did that youth study? The General Conference did a youth study of all the youth in the church or something, kind of followed youth to see where they were at as far as Adventism was concerned. I was working at the GC at the time. And around that time, I read something that was saying that religious organizations, or I'm not sure if it was that or if it was churches or whatever. Anyway, they have about a 5-generation lifespan. So the parents or the grandparents come in real excited about the religion, and then the next generation is a little less excited, and the next generation is a little less excited. And by the 5th generation, they are not members anymore very much. So I'm just wondering, Landon, if this sort of applies to what you've been seeing in your research.
Yeah, I'll definitely say that a lot of religions sometimes seem to be more focused on converting members than retaining members. It's a lot more exciting to, get a baptism from a conversion than to, keep a person that's already been baptized interested in attending and feeling included in the community. So I think that some of this is just that retention can be tough. People sometimes tend to, one of the best predictors of the religion you're going to be is whatever your parents were. But at the same time, sometimes people want to react against whatever their parents were because they're frustrated. An interesting thing that's happening is that now that there's more secular people, we're able to see our secular people keeping their kids secular. And a lot of times their kids become interested in some sort of spirituality or religion.
That's right.
And so, we have this movement where kids, they don't necessarily want to stay what their parents are. If we think about what makes a religion grow, really probably the most effective way to grow a religion, especially if you already have some members, is to have a large number of kids and keep them as a part of it. The Amish, they stay around because they have kids and keep some amount of them. I don't think that, I haven't seen numbers, but I would guess it's next to zero people convert to Amish. But the Amish stick around, and depending on, if other people's birth rates decline and theirs stay high, and if they get maybe better at keeping their people, they could become, eventually the whole world is Amish. So a religion doesn't need to convert anyone. It just needs to, have kids and keep them around. And, I think, though, that it's a lot less exciting and flashy to keep people involved in religion than to try to convert people. But really, if Adventism wanted to focus on growth, it might say, hey, you all should have more kids, and let's make sure that they, want to stay.
That's funny. I was just thinking too, another part of this was that the more educated each of the generations becomes, the less interested they are in the religion.
Yeah. And this is something that we definitely see where oftentimes, the people maybe start more different, but then they, move to the education levels of the society around them. Adventism, also even promotes education. And so we could imagine, that it's possible that some of the things promoted in it end up leading some people to question it. But an interesting thing that I think sometimes people are surprised to hear, and it's shown in the study that I was talking about young people, millennials over time. People who go to college don't necessarily leave religion more than other people. Oftentimes, it's just that when people leave home, they tend to leave religion. So, you think about, people going to college and leaving religion. It's possible that if those kids had moved away and not gone to college, they might have also left religion. And interestingly enough, people who get more religion in the United States tend to attend religious services more frequently than those who get less education. Now, some of this could operate a little differently. And like maybe, once people are getting certain types of education or certain levels, it could shift. But in some ways, I don't know that education is the thing leading people out. But when people do get more education, they do tend to become more the denominational type than the sectarian type.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you for that comment. I'm back and I'm getting a message that my internet is unstable. So I'm going to turn my picture off here in a minute, but I'm going to go to Ray and Bobby now. I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting talk there, and the statistics and everything. A lot of discussion talking about religion. So my question is, in your research and everything, have you separated out what people think or whatever when it comes to religion beliefs versus spiritual beliefs? Are they the same, different, or is there a mixture?
Yeah, so we oftentimes think about religion and spirituality going together, and they often do. But what I think is happening in the United States, at least, and I think in probably Europe and some of these other regions, is kind of a replacement of religion with spirituality, where there's a rising number of people who would maybe describe themselves as spiritual but not religious. I found meditation frequency going up at the same time that attendance frequency goes down, but interestingly, prayer frequency seems high. So I think that the things that we might think of as spiritual or personal, so maybe like prayer or meditation, these are things that I think that people are finding more meaningful. whereas religion, in terms of an organization, is what people are moving away from. So I think that increasingly we will see just as much, if not more, spirituality and less organized religion. The question is, does that spirituality look like the spirituality of religion, or does it look like something else? And I actually suspect that some of this will go back to what used to get called paganism, and that in many ways was stamped out by the Catholic Church, where it was a lot of indigenous and local beliefs and practices, where it might be tied to like nature more than necessarily a scripture. And so, I think that we're going to have, more new, but actually maybe ancient spiritualities, as religion has some amount of people who are frustrated by it.
Landon, FYI, I'm sorry interrupting Eugenia here, but Dr. Jim Walters taught our class a week or two ago, and one of the things he talked about was panentheism, and how reducing spirituality down to a more basic sort of, or reducing religion down to a more basic sort of spirituality may be the way that scientific people in the scientific age can understand religion better. I thought it was very interesting.
Yeah, I definitely think there's a increased openness to some forms of spirituality. And if we think about just what is getting spread on the internet, like younger generations, a lot of stuff that they're talking about is spiritual. It's just not often, religious. And, I think that interest in things like crystals is probably definitely not going down, and if anything, going up. There's also a rise of interest and sometimes belief in things like astrology and other types of things that, some types of organized religion might actually say it would be a negative thing, but yet is kind of, if anything, the opposite of the kind of like materialist atheism that people maybe assumed was going to happen with secularism.
Correct. Thank you.
That's an interesting observation. I'm going to go to Eduardo and ask you to unmute.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to share a quote and ask a question. Let me see if I can. Okay, Landon, can you see it?
Oh, yeah, I see the message. Let me look at it.
It's not the number that you gather into the truth, but it's the quality. The pity is misspelled, but the pity of those who take hold of the truth that counts. Remember when Israel numbered the population and the Lord was displeased with? What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that it's important to keep in mind, is Adventism maybe like winning if it increases in the numbers and counts, but yet maybe the people aren't serious about it, or they aren't, it's not impacting their lives, or they're not impacting the world. I think it's an important point that, like, I think sometimes people get a little too caught up in the numbers. And there's the one study that I showed where there's becoming fewer people in the middle. We could think about this as something like, and apologies that this is going to be a caffeine or an alcohol illustration, but we could think about the difference between espresso and coffee, or between maybe a beer and a liquor. There might be the same amount of caffeine in the espresso as the cup of coffee, even though it's a lot smaller. And so we might think about, if a religion has a very large number of people, but it's in some ways maybe diluted in terms of, the number of people that actually practice, their type of participation. You might have 10 times the number of people, but no more caffeine than the espresso, with the smaller number of people who were more intensely involved in it. And this was an illustration that came up when Mike Pence actually misquoted some of my research about, he said religion in the US was growing and becoming more intense. And it's not that religion was becoming more intense, it's religion is shrinking, but what remains is more intense. So there's a loss of the people who are in the middle. And so, you may have the same number of people praying every day, even as you have fewer people, praying once a month. And so you might wonder then, maybe religion starts to become espresso instead of a cup of coffee.
Can I add a thought? When I attend the annual council or the GC session, they make a big deal about the numbers when they report, the divisions reports. Oh, they make a big deal about the numbers. Thank you for your answer.
Yeah.
I'm going to go to Dan Jett, who's right down the hall from me, and ask him to unmute. I know he's trying to save me because I have no other raised hands. But if anybody else wants to get involved in the conversation, it's a really interesting topic. I'd encourage you to raise your hand. Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, I am blanked out because we have a common internet source here, and I don't want Gina to lose her connection. But she's a lovely person, and it'd be nice if her picture was on camera. I did want to, help fill in the blank with not as many people raising their hands, but there was a number of issues that occurred to me during the speech, and I appreciate, Landon, I appreciate the analysis that you gave. The question of Christian nationalism and the mix of politics came to mind immediately, and you kind of addressed that a little bit. And it spills over into other kind of social issues. But in a personal sense, there's other reasons besides just spiritual belief and that you change venues. I was raised in a Methodist church as a kid, kind of college age. I sort of left religion altogether until I joined a Presbyterian college age youth group, and I was on fire for Jesus with that. But that kind of faded after I grew up out of college. Married with kids, my first exposure to Adventism was we had a child with Gina and I, and she was very insistent on raising it in a Christian environment, in a religious environment, which is good with me. Had no exposure necessarily to Adventism. So we went to a very accepting and I guess progressive congregation, which happened to be Lauren's own congregation in Palo Alto, California, which I found very, very nourishing and very encouraging. Nice folks, not judgmental, very accepting. Had no real sense until later of more difficulty with the larger organized body and strict beliefs. But after that, I mean, I was involved in directly in the Lutheran Church and working for a nonprofit that was originally a Lutheran-based organization, but it had migrated to still a religious concerned, but not specifically denominational. And then we're back to a Methodist church when we moved again. A lot of this was just geographic. And now currently have an affiliation with the Presbyterian congregation because my son sings in the choir, and it's a very interesting church, very accepting. All of the ones that I enjoyed were ones that were very accepting congregations and very accepting local organizations. Not so much with the larger national or international group, but the thing that occurred to me about organizations splitting was in the Methodist Church during the time we were there, and moving forward, there was a great schism between, I guess, the more traditional, more restrictive members of the church, a point of view that looks a lot like the Christian nationalism issue, and those who had a more accepting, more humanitarian point of view. Do you see a lot of those large breaks in organizations? I wasn't aware of too many others that have done that. I don't think that could or will happen in the Adventist church, but I'm not sure. I suppose it's feasible that, or at least possible, it could split into another formal denomination. But I just wonder what your opinion is of the larger schisms and splits between the organized churches. I know that people spin off for individual reasons or form small groups, but anyway, I don't know. My question is very focused, but Landon, go ahead and tell me what your thoughts are on all that.
Yeah, no, A lot of times splits happen over social and political issues rather than theological. Sometimes a split is theological, but I think that, a lot of recent splits have been things like, do we, allow gay people in our congregations? And then a denomination splits on that. I think part of this is that when a group has never yet split, they don't want to split for the first time. But if groups have already split before, if the Methodists who have split before, then split again, I don't know how concerned they are about another split. Adventism, not really having split, I think wants to keep the global church as one. I do think that there could eventually be some sort of regional thing that would happen. But it could also be that at a certain point, there would be more autonomy given to different regions for them to sort of implement some policies to avoid a split, or to sort of just, sometimes what will happen is that they'll just come up with a new name for something. So like, okay, they won't allow women to be ordained, so let's do commissioning. And so, I think that there's workarounds that will get created to avoid what might otherwise lead to a split. Adventism definitely could split at some point, but I think that there's I don't think anyone really wants it to be the time that it splits. They don't want to be the cause of the split. They don't want to be a part of the split. And so I think there's a resistance against splitting. But yeah, definitely politics and social issues seem to become increasingly the dividing lines where people approach religion. Christian nationalism is a very fascinating thing. And there have been, local congregational splits or groups that don't really get along with each other. But that I think that the larger organization, I don't know. It's hard to say. It hasn't split for a long time. And sometimes what I say is the best predictor of the future is the past. And if the Adventist church hasn't split yet, I don't know that I'm going to predict that it is going to split, but also, anything can happen. So I don't know.
Well, I sense you weren't committing to any kind of prediction about what happens with the Christian nationalist movement, but you do talk about evolution and change in the various beliefs, and I think it's possible that it is on an uprise that may go the other direction at some point, or maybe some disillusionment on the part of some of the members and what they thought they were moving towards. But it's all very interesting, and again, in my personal view, I was not raised as an Adventist, so I didn't have a whole social structure and friends and family that I had to turn my back on when we kind of backed away from being active Adventists. So I didn't have that agony of losing my identity. But I understand it. I understand why it's a problem for a lot of the folks here on this forum who have identified with a group of people for their entire life, and it's hard for them to walk away from it. I get that quite a bit. But I found, and probably almost all the people here, probably everybody here is a wonderful person to know, and regardless of what religion or no religion they follow. And I think it's a nice place to congregate and discuss the issues. Anyway, I appreciate your comments and coming to speak with us. Thanks, Landon.
Yeah, thanks. And I do think that Adventism has changed, but sometimes quietly and in ways that no one really even fully brings up as a point that's ever debated. So if we think about something like, for example, pacifism, I would guess that some of the older folks here probably have experienced a very different Adventism. If we think about, is an Adventist church going to have like a service, around veterans who have served in a way that they bore arms? And if we think about something like even just the question of hell, do Adventists believe in hell? I think that there's, a lot of individuals who kind of do, even though the official position is maybe different, or even like an issue like abortion, that, there's an official position and then there's what the everyday people start to follow. And so I think Adventism is something that isn't fast to change, but is changing. And sometimes it's changing in ways towards becoming closer to Christian nationalism than moving away from it.
Interesting.
Yes.
Very interesting. We usually go till 12:30, and that's considered the conclusion. And we analogize this to being a church service. And then this is the time when we walk outside the church and chat with our friends. But we usually have a closing prayer, and I know Bjorn well enough to where I feel like I could ask him if he would give our closing prayer. And then your group is up next, you or Jeremy.
Thanks. Yeah, it's Jeremy this time, but yes, definitely, I'll pray. Father, thank you so much for this excellent conversation and presentation. It's great to be in a spiritual community, even though we're all at different points and feel differently about faith. It's good to be together and to enjoy conversation and dialogue. Wherever this is all leading on a global scale, we thank you for local congregations and the ability to have friends and fellow travelers along the way. And above all, your spirit leading us. We embrace that. So thank you for this conversation. Thank you for ATSS and everyone here. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Bjorn. Jeremy, what have you got to say?
Not a lot. As a pastor, so far, I had people that met
Jeremy, we can't
through their
understand
faith.
you.
I think they'd left the church for a while and had recently come back. Can you hear me now?
Yes, try again. Can you start over again? Maybe turn your picture off. Sometimes it helps.
I hope that my internet connection is stable enough for you to hear me.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
give it a shot.
Thanks. So the last church I was leading, I had a couple of people that had just returned to faith, and I was coaching them and navigating them through their spiritual journey. But they had quite a fascination going onto the internet and looking up certain things, and they would get down some rabbit holes that I just couldn't save them from. And so I just wondered, Doctor, what sort of impact you think the internet has had on some of the themes that you've presented today?
Yeah, I think Adventism has, an interesting history with the cultural ideas that the members take on. I don't know how many people here have read it. I definitely recommend it if you haven't. There's a book called Seventh-day Adventism in Crisis, Gender and Sectarian Change in an Emerging Religion. This book was actually a large part of what drew me to sociology. As I read this book and I was like, wow, like I could do sociology and examine groups like Adventism in this way. But the author, she basically traced how Adventism used to have more space for women, and that in trying to fit in with evangelical culture and not be seen as a cult, they started changing the roles that were available to women. And so, sometimes it was thought that these new religious movements and cults were like cults in part because they gave women too many opportunities in leadership. And so basically, Adventism, to fit in with evangelicalism, gave women fewer roles. And I think that Adventists have continued to kind of follow this thing where they want to fit in with evangelicalism to an extent, and they take in the politics that a lot of evangelicals are talking about. And the rabbit holes I think that a lot of Adventists go down are these like, QAnon and other types of things that are popular among conservative white evangelicals. And it's things that aren't traditionally Adventist. It's things that are like, about the broader culture, but it's not the general broader culture. It's this one particular part of broader culture. And I think that it's this desire to fit in with white evangelicalism that honestly probably creates a lot of the challenges and issues, at least in American Adventism, when there's, someone ends up on some conspiracy theory about QAnon, and that it's the internet, it can lead someone to any pathway. And I just get the sense that a lot of Adventists, they're not going to just, the general internet. They're going to, I don't know, wherever some people are going on some sorts of, ideological rabbit holes. And I do think that, the internet in many ways, for some people, it broadens their perspective. But I think in some people that it kind of makes them more myopic, and they get so narrowly focused in on one type of perspective. And then they have other people validating that perspective. That it then, the rabbit hole is hard to save them from some of those rabbit holes.
Thank you, Jeremy. I appreciated you getting us to think about that. Before I go to Lauren, I just want to ask Landon if you could give the name of that book again and the author. Was it Seventh-day Adventism in Crisis? Is that correct?
Yeah, Seventh-day Adventism in Crisis, Gender and Sectarian Change in an Emerging Religion. Let me see. Find the author.
Hmm.
She's a sociologist, but not an Adventist.
Yeah, I can find it. I can Google it and find it. I just needed to get the name.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Lauren, you're up.
I just want to remind everybody here at bottom of the hour that next week, Dr. Malcolm Russell is going to be doing a discussion of the book The Righteous Mind by evolutionary psychologist Jonathan Haidt. The title is Small Riders, Large Elephants. Is there an innate desire to choose good? So I think that's going to be very interesting, and I'm really glad to be bringing Dr. Russell into our group of teachers here. We've had some just amazing teachers through the years, and very happy to have him. First time he's going to be teaching for us. Something that I found interesting recently, Landon, took me by surprise. It's always so tempting to sort of oversimplify the sociological picture of who we are. So you've got the very intense conservatives who tend to be very oriented to the great controversy and those sorts of things. And then on the other hand, you have the sort of more cultural Adventists, like I think a lot of us here would be willing to admit we are. But then what happened at Berrien Village just sort of knocked me off my feet. I did not expect that there would be a group of people who would who would be so politically conservative that they would embrace Christian nationalism, embrace sort of non-mainstream ideas about vaccination, and would end up being hateful toward the General Conference. This is like a different stream that's emerging here. Took me totally by surprise. I would never have anticipated that. And yet here it is. And you have a group of people who would call themselves, again, the really true Seventh-day Adventist Church, but are almost hateful toward the church bureaucracy, more so than the liberals are, Landon. A lot of us, it seems to me like a lot of us really broke with the organization when they rejected women's ordination, but not that kind of bile that you're getting from these conservatives. I just took me by surprise. Just a comment, an observation for what it's worth. This is I guess I would say it's a lot more complicated than I expected it to be.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to think about how, we might think about a large organization as in some ways being inherently traditional because it has to move slow because it's large. And, you have to keep a lot of perspectives together. And so, there's not, but, I think that what's happening in the US with Christian nationalism is that there is this movement toward really strongly held views and sometimes vitriol against anyone who would try to oppose those views. I do get the sense that progressives, they want to take this like let's talk about it approach and like try to use logic and reason because it seems like progressives like to read books and consider ideas and so I think that the progressives when they disagree they say let's have a study about it and read about it and but then I think that sometimes there's people that hold strong views that their approach maybe starts adopting the approach from the broader society. And I think that among Christian nationalism, there is some of this anti-authority view that anyone who challenges like it is interesting that sometimes it's both groups wanting to have their autonomy to have their own beliefs.
Yeah.
but I do think that there sometimes are differences in the way that people tend to approach. Yeah, when one has an issue with the organization, how do they approach that? And I think there sometimes tend to be some of these political differences in approach.
Landon, do you mind answering the final two questions, even though we're past
Yeah,
3:30?
sure. Yeah.
Okay.
I've got Ed. I think it's Ed Breifschneider. Can you go ahead and unmute? I think you already did. Go ahead, Ed. Comes up as Edward. I think it's Ed Breifschneider. There you are. Did you have a comment? There you are.
First time I've ever showed up at Adventist Today Sabbath seminar in a bathrobe. I'm in New Zealand and it's kind of early in the morning.
Oh my.
Landon, I just tuned in a little while ago, so I missed your presentation. But I'm curious if your work has led you to something like a prescription of what you think Adventism should be and where it should be headed and what changes of emphasis it should have and things of that nature.
Yeah, this is a great question, and apologies for what might feel like I'm just avoiding it. In sociology, and this is something I say at the beginning of when I teach a sociology of religion class, I say that sociology isn't about teaching what is right or true, or even really about theology, but it's about describing things as they are. It is possible, though, from those descriptions to try to draw implications. And what we might then first ask is, what is the goal of Adventism? Is Adventism trying to grow? Is it trying to be true? Is it trying to be good? What is the thing that Adventism is trying to do? Is it trying to stay together? One thing that it might do if it wants to maintain and retain some of the younger people is it maybe allows a little more flexibility for some people to live and believe as they want. I remember, I think I was at the seminary when Ryan Bell was basically, the Hollywood church. I don't know how many people are familiar with this, but that he was basically asked to leave. And it showed me this kind of, you can be a bit of a progress person, you can be a bit of a reformer, but if you go too far, you're going to get booted out. And I think that allowing for maybe if that local congregation wanted to give up patriarchy for Lent, there's a choice whether you want to allow some congregations to be one way, to be a place that some people could go that who might not otherwise be able to be Adventist. So if there's wanting to maintain people, maybe allowing for different versions to exist. Allowing people to have some amount of autonomy, maybe allowing different regions of the world to have some different policies. I think people might disagree on whether there should be different policies in different regions, but that would be potentially one way to allow for a little bit more unity in community, but difference in policy. And is that the right way to go? I don't know. Is the goal to keep people? Is the goal to convert people? I will also say that strict religions tend to perform better than ones that allow way too much flexibility. So, one might say, we should allow flexibility of all things, but then once you allow too much flexibility, then people just say, well, like, why do I bother going? I haven't given anything up for this. The more people sacrifice for their religion, there's a classic sociology or economics article called Why Strict Churches Are Strong. And it basically is that the more you've given up for it, the less you want to leave it because you feel like you've made bad choices in your life. If you gave up the career you wanted, if you gave up the relationship you wanted, if you gave up a lot of things to stay, you now want to keep staying, or else you regret your life choices. There's something to be said about strictness. But I think that also too much strictness then leads some people to just want to leave. And it really just keeps the overly fervent people, perhaps. Is there one right answer? I don't know. Personally, I might say maybe allow for a little more flexibility and people to, local congregations to have some amount of choice about how they practice. But it's some people might say that unity is the most important thing. Some people might say growth is the most important thing. So I think in some ways it depends on the goals that people have.
Landon, one of our authors, wrote an article on this topic, and he took it from the point of view of the sunk cost.
Yep.
Well, that's interesting. Landon, I have a question for you about the LGBT community and the position of the church on that. And I know there are people who will tell you that they believe that if you are LGBT, that you are doomed to hellfire forever. You have no chance of salvation. And it seems to me that if you are a Christian and you believe that, then you would think that this is the only opportunity that the LGBT person has for happiness is in this life. It seems like you should be kinder to them and more accepting of them because this is their only shot. Instead of kicking them out, being unkind, being cruel, it seems like that doesn't really resonate with the Christian model. There's the exclusivity of the church, I find very troubling, and not just the Adventist church, but the need to divide, the need to kick out, the need to other. It seems like if there are people that you are convinced are not going to receive salvation, you should be even kinder to them now if this is their only shot at it. What do you think?
I will say that was the perspective of a lot of people in the study and the interviews, that they, basically said, if we're supposed to love people, these are people, shouldn't we love them? Or people who were themselves gay, saying like, I'm told Jesus loves me, but then all the people who follow Jesus hate me. And so, again, this is a case where people are going to have their views and what they are, but one could ask about something like the golden rule and how it would be applied. I will say that a lot of people in the study would say that religion excluding gay people is a large part of why they left.
I know it is for me. Yeah. Anyway, I'm going to go to Ed Zerkowitz. Please, Ed, go ahead and unmute. I think you have already. Go ahead.
Hi, Landon. Thanks for you and others' analytic attempts of the Adventist Church. And there's been some discussion about why people leave and yet they can't let go and they keep coming back, even though they may be atheists now and so forth. So I'm going to throw something else in here and see if you have an opinion on it. There's many elements to what you might call addictive personalities, which I won't go into. I'm not an expert on that, but people keep repeating certain behaviors. They have to have something. They have to have their thinking might be obsessive and certain other things. And maybe part of what attracts people to the Adventist Church, even though they may at one level think there's just not enough right about it, is it's so different. It's almost like they're addicted to this difference, having their own profit and lifestyle, even though a lot of other Christians might think Adventists are weird, but they're addicted to that idea. They become addictive, or maybe they already were addictive, and they just can't let go of that or figure out how to get over that. Do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great point. I think a lot of times what appeals about a new religious movement is you feel like you have special truth that other people don't have. If you're in a denomination that kind of believes a very similar thing to everyone else, you don't really get to feel as special. You maybe still have community, you have beliefs, but you don't get to feel like you know more than everyone else. I get the sense that some Adventist evangelism almost tries to play up like, hey, if you come believe like us, you're right and everyone else is wrong. I know that a lot of people that I've heard from who have left Adventism, it seems like they maybe are a little more likely to become atheists than people who leave other religions, because they're taught that Adventists are right and everyone else is wrong. And then if they come to the view to wonder, well, are Adventists right? If they come to the view that they don't know the Adventists are right, they're not going to just go necessarily become Methodist or Lutheran like maybe a Presbyterian would, who isn't sure about Presbyterianism. They're like, okay, I'll go be a Methodist now. I think, it's sort of like there's an excitement, I think, about feeling like you know things that no one else does, and then also a pressure to think that if this is wrong, then everything is wrong. So yeah, I think that Adventism could self-reflect on, is there about some sort of intellectual hubris in feeling like Adventists know all the truth and everyone else is completely wrong? And how does this maybe relate to some sorts of conspiracy theories and some of these rabbit holes people go down on the internet? Because I think that the appeal of a lot of this is to feel like you have special information that no one else has. And then you get to feel like you're a good person and you know better than everyone else if you know the truth and others don't.
So or they can stay weird then.
Yeah.
Landon, I had two other hands that were raised. One was Dana and one was Patty Tompkins. And Dana sends a message in the chat saying, I don't have good signal. So it's difficult to ask a question, but I would like to go back to the conversation about the possibility of a split in Adventism. I personally believe that we are already split in some ways. We are already divided in terms of theology, culture, politics, education, social issues, and sociological perspective. We are separated. However, as an institution, we might never split because of the bylaws that stipulate that all churches / the physical buildings belong to the GC, which or the White Estate. This is not my argument. It's Dave Larson's argument for why the church will never split. It's like a prenup that makes the divorce an impossible alternative. So we don't split in half. We split little by little, like the glaciers or icebergs. Yes, from time to time, a big chunk will fall off, like Berrien Springs. So interested to hear your response to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great question. I think it makes it probably very hard for a large group to split off. I think that what then might be more likely is local congregations maybe splitting, because then the people themselves are the thing that is there rather than it being about the buildings and the organization. I think that this is a great point and could be a part of why things might not split. But I also suspect that if people did want to split, that there might be ways that people got creative in making that split happen. I suspect this is a part of why that splitting is less likely. But I also think that if there was no option but to split, there would be a way found to do the split.
Well, thanks for giving light on that. Dr. Johnston, go ahead. I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Yeah, I think what the Adventist Church needs, and which they have a little of, but they need more of, are Adventists that other people admire and Adventists that we are proud of. We have a few. We're becoming more denominational in the sense that we have congressmen and cabinet members and people like Barry Black and people like that. We have people like Herbert Bloomstead, and we have all the publicity about blue zones. This is the thing that attracts people more than doctrines, and it keeps people more than doctrines.
Yeah, I think that I think the blue zones, I think there's definitely some things that could almost be used as strategic marketing to show that there are maybe these positive outcomes. Maybe thinking about who the famous Adventists are, trying to show kind of, not just the maybe having the true beliefs, but also that being a part of this community leads to some sort of positive outcomes. And I definitely think that, the denominationalization does mean that there are more people who are perhaps leaders in their field in some way that then become illustrations that can be used in essentially marketing.
I'm gonna give you a comment here to wrap it up, because this has been kind of a sociological study. This is Carmen Seibold's observation. People who leave a high commitment religion can tend to have some trouble fitting in outside culture. or feeling understood. So there are X groups of former Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, Amish, etc. I think that's interesting.
Yeah, this is an interesting observation. So yeah, like, where does someone who was raised with this really strong community go after leaving it? I moved around a lot as a kid, and I remember like anywhere we went, there was an Adventist congregation probably not too far away, and you automatically got treated as family. But I can imagine then that, someone leaves this, and, where do you find that automatic family? And sometimes it might be some sort of X group because, who understands what it was like to be Adventist, but someone who was Adventist. I know growing up, sometimes though, I would just have strange groups of friends that were people that just sort of got some parts of what it was to be Adventist. Like I remember I had a friend in the neighborhood who was Muslim, and we were friends because we'd talk about how we both didn't drink and ate not ate clean meat, although I was vegetarian. But I think that sometimes people find community among people who can understand some of these more quirks of lifestyle. And I think that, yeah, I mean, I think this is part of why some people stay while not believing, or why sometimes the kind of ex-Adventists might be the people that one might find the most community with, rather than, generic people that don't understand what it was like to grow up that way.
Well,
Landon,
Lauren, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Yeah, just a reminder, everybody, Dr. Malcolm Russell will be our teacher next week. And Landon, this was so wonderful for me. Have been looking forward to this class for a long time. And plus, there's that little bit of a North Dakota connection. By the way, this idea that we know what is right and everybody else is wrong. I've often wondered, is that why it works so well for us North Dakota Germans? Germans like rigid categories, rules. We're right and everybody else is wrong. And we can tell our neighbors that we keep the Sabbath and they don't, and they're going to be lost. They don't even know it. There's a lot of those North Dakota Germans. A lot of them ended up in high church positions and did very well. Hey, thanks so much.